a number of things came up repeatedly. I think there clearly is a consensus that this is a serious problem, that the struggle goes on, and something must be done about this. Otherwise, it will exacerbate and fuel the continuing jihad campaign in a variety of ways. So there we have a fair amount of agreement. There is clearly not a consensus on the desirability of repatriation because of the matter of risk. That this is not a benign population that we're talking about bringing back. This is there are real risks here, and there are real risks. That is undeniable. I think there's consensus that the women and children pose particular problems in this, as opposed to a lot of previous situations. How do nations deal with this? Now, it's not entirely unprecedented, because certainly in the African countries there have been a number of efforts to deal with children fighters, children warriors, and that. But those are programs in Africa, in African conflict zones or previous conflict zones, and they remain there. It's not a matter of importing that problem into a different part of the world. I think there is some consensus that that whatever the legal regime will be, and that will be difficult, but whatever is done in the legal realm, that there must be some effort made at rehabilitation or de-radicalization and so on. I would offer here that the reluctance of European governments to repatriate many of these people also reflects a degree of skepticism about the effectiveness of rehabilitation and de-radicalization programs. Now, there's been a lot of research on these efforts, a lot of it based in Asian efforts, Middle Eastern efforts, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Malaya, and Malaysia, and so on. However, where the skepticism comes into play is those countries claim extraordinary success rates. And there's some question about that, because those countries are also countries where they can exercise a degree of social control, where they can intervene socially far beyond a simple program aimed at the individual, where they can provide spouses, where they can offer jobs. They can, in a sense, in a kind of a soft fashion, but nonetheless effectively, hold families responsible for the behavior of individuals, or hold tribes responsible, or clans responsible, and so on. And none of that, therefore, is directly fungible to the more liberal, individualistic environment, democratic environment of the West. So if it works in Saudi Arabia, doesn't mean necessarily it's going to work in Germany. And so there's a real issue here on that, and as I say, a reluctance in it. So those are some of the. There's many takeaways. I have my notebook filled with notes, but we've got a good 45 minutes here for discussion now and for your questions, and so happy to invite your questions now.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Jenkins, for giving me the floor. I would like to make some comments after these presentations. First of all, about figures and numbers in Syria, in the detention camps of SDF and in particular Al-Hol. As you described your figures, I think it's a little bit less because figures are bigger, but figures of Deborah is much bigger than it is, and because according to our data, it's something in between, especially for Al-Hol. Regarding jihadi wives, first of all. We don't like to imagine that they are angels with wings on their backs. You know that some of them are extremely radicalized, and it could be explained because living in the environment of zealots for many years, it could not be without implications. And in addition to it, in some terrorist organizations, even wives, jihadi wives, should swear in. But in any case, Russia has a good experience in expatriation of jihadi wives and families and children home, like other countries like Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, I think, and like the US. Yeah, and regarding your figures about the US, official figures published in the US are less also for FTFs than yours.
No, so they estimate 300 have attempted or tried to go, according to the FBI. We've been able to identify, the number's actually gone up. I wrote 79, but it went up this week. So 82 individuals by name who we know have traveled. So that's including the FBI estimates, includes those that have attempted to travel, and so those that didn't actually go. That's why the number is 300.
Yeah.
Can I intervene here just to follow up on the numbers thing? One of the reasons for the disparity between the numbers that were reported having gone or attempted to go and those who attempted to go we know about because they were brought to trial, so they're easy to identify. But there is still a gap between those who were not arrested before they left the country and those we have been able to identify. In other words, there is a theoretical at-large population. Why can't we even identify them? Because there are a lot of unsealed indictments. That is where the authorities know who they are and are prepared to charge them, but don't identify them publicly because that would interfere with the investigation, and it would also interfere with the fact that as they attempt to return, if they do attempt to return and are arrested, it gives the authority the opportunity to recruit them for intelligence purposes, and therefore there's a population of unsealed indictments. I'm sorry to... But go ahead and we'll come back.
Should I continue a little bit?
Please.
Regarding tribunal, regarding the idea of the international tribunal or hybrid tribunal, our position is that this tribunal, the idea is non-realistic, as Emeritus told us, and we share this opinion. Why? Because there was no any legal precedent of it. As you know, current international courts, international tribunals, their mandate lies in the sphere of international humanitarian law. Genocide, atrocities, And it sounds completely ridiculous to create tribunal for terrorism, which is a part of conventional crimes. That is why we don't share this idea, and our strict position is that all these foreign terrorist fighters should be given to the justice of these countries where they committed their crimes. I mean, Syria and Iraq. Either this option or another option is to give them back to European countries. As European countries don't want both these options, because the first option for them is the recognition of the legitimate government of Syria. That's now European countries have created this legal limbo with these people. And what can we do now? First of all, we should do the so-called harm reduction. Even we don't like this notion in the sphere of drugs in our country, harm reduction. But regarding foreign terrorist fighters, we think that it should be legitimate. I mean that we should, first of all, we should continue and we should pursue effective international cooperation, exchange of information regarding FTF to prevent the expansion. And of course, to work within the UN, within the sanctions committees, listing international terrorist organizations like we do it together with the US regarding ISIL Khorasan, and now we are doing it regarding ISIL West Africa and ISIL Greater Sahara. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I answer?
Daphne, you wanted to
Yeah, thank you. I just
follow
want
up
to
on
say
her.
a few words because we mentioned a couple times the option of international trial or hybrid tribunal. I think you mentioned, and I didn't have a chance to talk about this at all. And I think your question gives me an opportunity to say a few things. And I will focus actually on your question. When you say we don't share, we also agree that it's unrealistic. I just wanted to clarify who is we. This is Russia? Russia? Okay. So here's what I think about this. So it's true that international criminal tribunals are usually established in order to try, first of all, the more senior leaders who are responsible for the gravest atrocities. And indeed, the three most common international crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. But there have been situation in which terrorism was included in the jurisdiction of a hybrid tribunal, and that's the case of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which is a tribunal that was established following the killing of the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, and that tribunal is funded both by Lebanon and by the United Nations. So it has jurisdiction over the crime of terrorism. And so that in and of itself cannot be an obstacle. There are many obstacles, I agree with you, as to whether an international trial is possible. I don't believe this is one of them, and I don't want to elaborate more because I don't want to speak too much, but I want to say one more thing about the possibility, about another example basically of a hybrid trial, which was the trial of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and some of his followers. So that was an interesting model because it addressed the situation of the death penalty that we are struggling with to some extent. And so there were international observers. What was the hybrid character of that tribunal? International observers were dispatched or participated in those trials. And that's what made it hybrid, and that's what was the compromise reached there. I'm not sure this is necessarily a model for our situation, but definitely there's been many NGOs recording what has been happening in Syria, gathering information as the war was going on. There was a lot of work that was being done, including in clinics in the United States, law schools. So in terms of having information, I think there is some. I think this is nice to say we don't have enough evidence or the battlefield evidence is not good enough. this has been happening in a context of many conflicts, Yugoslavia, Rwanda. Like, why would this be that different? I actually don't really buy that argument. But terrorism is not the problem.
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you very much, Mr. Vigno. Thank you.
But I don't think that the nature of tribunal for Lebanon is quite similar than hybrid tribunal for ISIL.
Well, there is no tribunal for ISIS, so.
Because the nature of the tribunal of Lebanon is quite limited.
I think there is a general consensus. There's some differences on the likelihood of a tribunal and a jurisdiction and whether it's appropriate. I do tend to be, honestly myself, skeptical in terms of a tribunal because I think the international complexities of setting one up and even a more limited one within the European Union, that the degree of agreement and the complexity in setting it up would just take so long and it would be so complicated that it tends, not for legal reasons, but just for practical reasons, may not be a realistic issue if we're talking about solving a problem within the next year or two. So I think the urgency of the situation tends to be an argument against the tribunal as a realistic assumption, which is not a legal argument. It's just, can we pull it together? Could it be pulled together fast enough? I'm not sure.
The most natural place would be the ICC, because that's the permanent tribunal we now have to try these crimes. But the ICC does not have jurisdiction at the moment, and in order to have it, it would have to be granted by the Security Council. And given that Russia doesn't support this option, I believe that makes it quite an unrealistic option indeed.
And China.
Yeah, and China.
Go ahead.
So this question is directed at Daphne as well. You made reference to two conditions for returning of foreign terrorist fighters. I echo Brian's statement of there is a complete lack of independently validated empirical data on any form of rehabilitation. That's my first point. The second point, which I'd like to address further, is that your second point was monitor all family members. Coming from a liberal democracy like Canada, this is a complete impossibility for most countries. We are all stretched, every big and small countries, stretched in our resources, monitoring people that we're worried about going to commit an imminent attack. That's number one. And number two, liberal democracies like Canada and many other Western countries, human rights pressures have been shown. There's tremendous precedence of a watering down of monitoring abilities over time and challenges to human rights in the higher courts. So with all due respect, I think both of the recommendations are really not practical or attainable in Western democracies.
Answer?
Please.
Okay, so about rehabilitation, I agree with you. We don't have enough information. Definitely, what could happen at the moment is that the EU could lead these efforts. And I'm sure Magnus will have to say something about this. And the UN could lead these efforts as well. I mean, I feel like it's the next step in the process to try to really sit together and think about how we're going to build those and build them while talking to each other and exchanging what we see as the main difficulties and challenges. But I'll leave you to add more to that in a second. About the human rights pressure. So I'm like the last person to not be cognizant about the human rights limitations. And these limitations are huge in the European countries as well, with the European Court of Human Rights. And you cannot, if you read the UN documents, you'll see that all of these measures need to be taken in accordance to human rights law. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. I'm not sure. I didn't mean family members in general. I meant the family members that are returning.
But even them, we've been shown tons of precedents where we've been year after year it gets watered down, challenged, watered down, to where we're left with no tools whatsoever.
Yeah, well, so here is, I guess, where I beg to differ. I think that there has to be a compromise that is reached on this specific issue of the foreign fighters. If we allow them to return, as opposed to facing the backlash of leaving them in Syria and abandoning or abdicating national responsibility for nationals, then I think there has to be some really robust system that is made in place to keep an eye on these individuals. And I think if it's not done, then maybe we shouldn't repatriate them. So I believe that human rights. I do the law. I do international humanitarian law. I do human rights law. It's all about a balance, achieving a balance that is the right balance. This data, for example, on the children can be kept confidential. Maybe there has to be some safeguards in place, definitely. But at the same time, being cognizant of the security threat, there has to be a balance that is achieved. And maybe in some countries it's impossible, and maybe these countries will choose not to repatriate. Do I think this is the good solution? I don't. So.
Just very quickly on the issue. I mean, for women from most EU countries, of course we can take them back. We can also handle them. Some of them don't want to return back. And if you're talking about numbers, we're talking about 2 digits. I mean, in Sweden, maybe about 27 women, 65 kids. It's not a big number. Most of the country, I think, that has more problems are the larger countries like France. But then you have a legal process. The reason why some of the countries don't want to take them back is that they don't have the laws to prosecute them. It's political suicide for them to say, hey, come back. Yeah, it's okay. You have committed atrocities. The men, of course, are incarcerated, so they're not going to come back. So that they are stuck in a legal limbo.
I have 2 questions back up here. You and then you, and let's get the 2 questions back to back here.
First of all, one short comment. We are 40 years after the first theater of jihad. It started in 1979. Since then, we had several theaters of jihad in the post-Soviet Union era, in Balkans, in Chechnya. We have the theater of jihad in Iraq between 2003 to 2011, let's say. And we are still asking, are we prepared for the challenge? After each jihad, we had the returnees. After each theater of jihad, we had the new generation of jihadists. So in this panel, I heard a lot about the concern of Europe, and to a lesser degree in the United States, with the returnees to Europe or the United States. I'm not underestimating the problem, but this is not the problem. The real problem is what will happen with tens of thousands of jihadists that are included under the topic of foreign fighters, but they came from Egypt, from Tunisia, from Saudi Arabia, and so on. I didn't hear a single word about the policy, what to do with them. And this is, I believe, the real challenge for the next theater of jihad.
I think it's an entirely appropriate comment, and the fact is, there's no question that this panel was focused on the return, as I said at the outset, the focus on the return of the Western foreign fighters. That is not to say that the Egyptians, the Tunisians, and others are not important, or in fact are not even a greater challenge than that. But to point this out, I mean, one of the reasons that we still have this continuing jihadist campaign 40 years later is the fact that the embryos of the next jihad are in the effluence of the previous jihad, and it's the fact that we haven't interrupted that cycle, that we just keep on reproducing what is now a multi-generational phenomenon. Before we respond to other, let me take the question behind you too, because I want to get both of these in.
Okay. I live in Paris, and I think of this argument here as an offset between a certain satisfaction to the public, particularly those who are drawn to Le Pen and extreme right movements, by providing the semblance of justice, and on the other hand, providing some type of system which is going to allow for a de-radicalization. My question here is, thinking out of the box, would it be possible to take the Nuremberg trials or Gacaca of the Rwandan trials, which would give a chance to the perpetrators, possibly not their families, but showing that they have in fact changed their way of life, changed their thoughts. This was the case of the Gacaca period, giving a fixed period of a year to those who were involved in the killings. And certainly, I mean, if you want to use the example of Nuremberg in order to show a denazification as the basis for de-radicalization, that would be, I think, a very clear message to the extreme right.
Let me respond to that, because one of the things that I had thought about and am writing about now, just again to be ferociously pragmatic. Obviously, if we listen to all the questions, and the questions are right, and the challenges are right, is an international tribunal likely to work? Well, reasons we probably can't do that. Are there real risks with repatriation? Absolutely. Do we have confidence in de-radicalization? Not really. And so, in a sense, one by one, we're going through every one of our options other than leave them to die in the desert as the course of action. And that's why we are where we are. But we may not be able to solve the problem, but there may be ways of reducing it. And reducing it would involve several things. First of all, it would involve an investment by the international community, by the principal countries involved, to simply address the current conditions in El Hol and the camps there. That is, we've heard time and time again, this is a humanitarian crisis. And whether we regard these people as dangerous, as if they were in a prison in any one of the countries, there still is requirement for humane treatment. And what we have now is a kind of collective punishment by neglect. So we can improve the conditions in the camp. Maybe it's separate camps with smaller populations or so on. That's number one. Number two, having heard things about guards not going in some parts of the camp, being frightened and so on, we certainly can improve the quality of the security within the camp and the security around the camp, so there's not going to be the kind of mass jailbreaks that we saw in Iraq and so on in Yemen and elsewhere. Third, there can begin a process of sorting out that population, and among them, there may be some who want to come back, but a price of coming back is renunciation of, this is getting closer to the Italian repentance program, but a public renunciation and cooperation with the authorities. And the practical objective of that is to so contaminate them by the cooperation that they will not be trusted recruits to go back into anything. The fourth would be a significant but interviewing effort of every single one, whether they cooperate or not, so that every single potential returnee would have spent a long time being interviewed, and do it in conditions so that it cannot get around about who was cooperating or providing information and who is not. In other words, what you're going to try to do, you may not be able to de-radicalize them, but you can make them less desirable for others that may want to recruit them in and do that. You can do that sorting out there. And if you want to come back, you cooperate. People say, well, how do you know they're sincere? You don't give a damn that they're sincere or not. I don't have an X-ray for a man's soul. I don't know if he's sincere. But if you do these things publicly, then that is a step. And some may come back even with an agreement to serve a custodial sentence or to do other things that will make them, will reduce in some fashion the risk. In that case, it's not going to apply to every one of them. There are going to be ways that you'll still be left with a certain population, but you will be seeing to be doing justice. You will be bringing some back. You will be reducing the population that you're worried about. So it's a partial solution. With that, I'll shut up. Magnus.
I mean, I don't. It's a humanitarian issue. What's happening, all right? And if you think about it, it's not that many sort of foreign FTFs that are in the camp. It's not insurmountable problem to bring them back. It's a political issue because most governments don't want to. I would say that we're looking at the wrong end of the problem here. Yes, the world, the point that was made earlier, the world is a stormy place. There are lots more serious jihadi conflicts. I mean, this is wonderful thing, I think, in the UN report about Idlib being the largest dumping ground of jihadists and so on. We're not even talking about Al-Qaeda. I was an expert witness in a case in Norway with an Uyghur who, there are 5,000 Uyghurs fighting, in Idlib with AQ-related groups. So, but I think we need to get, when we bring them back, this whole discussion, I think, is a subset issue because we don't have our house in order. And that is why I speak about the Salafi ecosystem, right? These guys, they're not really where we should focus the issue. We should focus the issue of getting down the Salafi ecosystem, and you only do that by pressurizing these environments, by going after their financing, by really putting pressure, by prosecuting them. They're not going to spend a long time in prison. Unfortunately, we are not the United States. You don't put people away for 30, 40, 50 years. They get maybe, if you've been down to Syria, you maybe get 7 to 10. You're out after 5. And so we have this sort of hamster wheel of people being prosecuted, then they come out, then they re-radicalize. And these guys who are in Syria, I see it as a humanitarian issue for the women and the children. And we have to deal with that issue. On the issue of I think there will be some type of tribunal, maybe not in my lifetime, and it will involve FTFs, all the parties of the conflict, it will, including Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime. I am convinced of that. I know I was going to step into, but I'm convinced of that. There will be, history will be harsh on all sides of this conflict, but I am pretty sure I may not be alive, so it won't maybe matter for me, but you never know when it will be the time. Right?
I'm afraid I've just received a word from powers that be, I think is the expression, that we have to conclude early because someone has arrived. Someone important has arrived, as opposed to us. And therefore, I've been asked if we can cut short. I do want to thank I want to thank all of you for participating in the session. I think we could have had a good discussion going on far more than another 15 minutes. It could be a good long discussion. I do want to thank again my this really splendid panel of speakers. So thank.